The Korean War, spanning from 1950 to 1953, was a significant and complex conflict that had far-reaching implications for the Korean Peninsula and the broader international order. The war involved numerous phases, marked by dramatic shifts in momentum, extensive international involvement, and substantial human and material costs. The overall war situation can be examined by looking into the events chronologically and understanding the strategic and tactical decisions made by the involved parties, primarily North Korea, South Korea, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. The war began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces, under the command of Kim Il-sung and with the support of the Soviet Union, launched a surprise invasion of South Korea. The North Korean People's Army KPA quickly advanced southward, capturing the South Korean capital, Seoul, within days. The rapid advance of the KPA was facilitated by their superior numbers, better training, and the element of surprise. South Korean forces, along with the small contingent of American troops stationed in Korea, were initially overwhelmed and forced into a retreat. In response to the invasion, the United Nations Security Council, with the absence of the Soviet Union who was boycotting the council at the time, passed Resolution 82, condemning the North Korean aggression and calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Subsequently, the Security Council passed Resolution 83, recommending that member states provide military assistance to South Korea. This marked the beginning of a broad international coalition led by the United States to defend South Korea. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, United Nations forces, composed primarily of American troops, along with contingents from other member states, were quickly mobilized. Despite initial setbacks, the United Nations Command managed to establish a defensive perimeter around the southeastern port city of Pusan. This area, known as the Pusan Perimeter, became the last bastion for United Nations forces in South Korea during the initial phase of the war. The fierce defense of the Pusan Perimeter in August and September 1950 was crucial in halting the North Korean advance and buying time for reinforcements and resupply. The turning point in the early phase of the war came with the successful execution of the Incheon landing in September 1950. General MacArthur orchestrated a daring amphibious assault at the port city of Incheon, located near Seoul, far behind North Korean lines. The Incheon landing, executed with precision and surprise, effectively cut off North Korean supply lines and forced the KPA to retreat in disarray. United Nations forces quickly recaptured Seoul and pursued the retreating North Korean troops northward, crossing the 38th parallel into North Korean territory. By October 1950, United Nations forces had pushed deep into North Korea, nearing the Yalu River, which marks the border with China. This advance towards the Chinese border raised significant alarm in Beijing. The Chinese government, led by Mao Zedong, viewed the approach of United Nations forces as a direct threat to Chinese national security and sovereignty. In response, China decided to intervene in the war, deploying the People's Volunteer Army PVV under the command of General Peng Dehuai. In late October 1950, Chinese forces launched a massive counteroffensive against the advancing United Nations troops. The entry of Chinese forces into the war marked a significant escalation and dramatically altered the balance of power on the Korean peninsula. The Chinese intervention, characterized by large-scale human wave attacks and nighttime assaults, caught United Nations forces off guard. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in November and December 1950 was one of the most brutal and decisive engagements of the war. Despite harsh winter conditions and fierce resistance, Chinese forces managed to inflict heavy casualties on United Nations troops, forcing them to retreat southward. The Chinese counteroffensive continued into early 1951, pushing United Nations forces back below the 38th parallel and recapturing Seoul. However, the United Nations Command, now reinforced and better prepared for the tactics employed by Chinese and North Korean forces, launched a series of counteroffensives. By March 1951, United Nations troops had once again recaptured Seoul and stabilized the front near the 38th parallel. This period marked a shift from rapid advances and retreats to a more static and entrenched form of warfare, resembling World War I trench battles. Throughout 1951 and 1952, the Korean War entered a protracted stalemate, with both sides fortifying their positions along the front lines near the 38th parallel. The fighting during this period was characterized by intense battles for strategic hills and ridges, heavy artillery bombardments, and significant casualties on both sides. Notable engagements included the battles for Heartbreak Ridge and Pork Chop Hill, where United Nations and Communist forces repeatedly clashed over contested terrain. The static nature of the war led to a war of attrition, with both sides suffering heavy losses without achieving significant territorial gains. Diplomatic efforts to end the war began as early as mid-1951. Armistice negotiations were held at Panmunjom, a village near the 38th parallel. However, The talks were protracted and frequently stalled over various issues, including the exchange of prisoners of war, the establishment of a demilitarized zone, and the future political status of Korea. The negotiations were further complicated by the uncompromising positions of both sides and the broader geopolitical context of the Cold War. Despite the ongoing negotiations, fighting continued unabated. The air war over Korea also intensified during this period, with United Nations forces, primarily the U.S. Air Force, conducting extensive bombing campaigns against North Korean infrastructure, supply lines, and military targets. The air superiority achieved by United Nations forces played a critical role in limiting the capabilities of North Korean and Chinese ground forces. The Korean War saw significant involvement from various international actors. The Soviet Union provided substantial military and logistical support to North Korea and China, including advisors, pilots, and advanced weaponry such as MiG-15 fighter jets. The aerial battles between Soviet-piloted MiGs and United Nations aircraft, particularly over the area known as MiG Alley, were a notable aspect of the war. However, Soviet involvement remained largely covert, with Soviet pilots often flying under North Korean or Chinese markings to maintain plausible deniability. The humanitarian impact of the Korean War was devastating. The conflict resulted in millions of casualties, including a significant number of civilian deaths. The widespread destruction of cities, towns, and infrastructure left much of the Korean peninsula in ruins. The war also caused massive displacement, with millions of Koreans becoming refugees. The human suffering and material devastation wrought by the war had long-lasting effects on Korean society and contributed to deep-seated animosities between the North and South. By 1953, both sides had become weary of the protracted conflict and the heavy toll it was taking. The death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in March 1953 also contributed to a shift in the geopolitical landscape, as the new Soviet leadership sought to reduce Cold War tensions. These factors, along with continued military stalemate and pressure from the international community, created a more conducive environment for achieving an armistice. On July 27, 1953, after more than 2 years of arduous negotiations, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed at Panmunjom. The agreement established a ceasefire, effectively ending the active hostilities of the Korean War. The armistice created the Korean Demilitarized Zone (DMZ), a buffer zone roughly following the 38th parallel, which served as the de facto border between North and South Korea. The DMZ remains one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world to this day. The armistice also provided for the exchange of prisoners of war and the establishment of mechanisms for the peaceful resolution of future disputes. However, it did not result in a formal peace treaty, leaving the Korean peninsula technically in a state of war. The absence of a peace treaty has perpetuated the division of Korea and the ongoing military and political tensions between North and South Korea. The Korean War had profound and lasting effects on the geopolitical landscape of East Asia and the broader Cold War context. For the United States and its allies, the war underscored the importance of containing communism and maintaining a strong military presence in East Asia. The conflict also solidified the United States' commitment to the defense of South Korea, leading to a long-term military alliance and the continued presence of U.S. forces on the Korean peninsula. For China, the Korean War marked its emergence as a major military power capable of challenging U.S. influence in the region. The war also strengthened the bond between China and North Korea, laying the foundation for a close but often complicated alliance. The experience gained by the People's Liberation Army during the conflict had significant implications for China's military doctrine and development in the subsequent decades. The Soviet Union's involvement in the Korean War highlighted the complexities of the Cold War alliance system. While the Soviets provided crucial support to North Korea and China, the war also exposed the limitations of Soviet influence and the divergent interests within the communist bloc. The conflict further intensified the arms race and the global competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. For both North and South Korea, the war was a defining moment in their respective histories. The conflict entrenched the division of the Korean peninsula, leading to the development of two starkly different political, economic, and social systems. The war also left deep scars on the Korean people, with the memories of the conflict continuing to shape inter-Korean relations and the collective psyche of the Korean nation. In the years following the armistice, both North and South Korea undertook extensive efforts to rebuild and develop their respective societies. South Korea, with substantial aid from the United States and other Western countries, embarked on a path of rapid industrialization and economic growth. Over the decades, South Korea transformed from a war-torn nation into a prosperous and democratic society, becoming one of the world's leading economies. In contrast, North Korea, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, pursued a policy of juche, or self-reliance, emphasizing centralized economic planning and military strength. The North Korean regime established a highly controlled and autocratic state, marked by significant human rights abuses and economic challenges. Despite these differences, the legacy of the Korean War continues to influence both countries' policies and their relations with each other and the broader international community. The Korean War also had a significant impact on international military strategy and doctrine. The conflict highlighted the importance of air power, combined arms operations, and the need for effective coordination among allied forces. The lessons learned from the Korean War informed the military strategies and tactics of the United States and its allies in subsequent conflicts, including the Vietnam War. In conclusion, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953 was a complex and multifaceted conflict that had far-reaching implications for the Korean Peninsula and the global geopolitical landscape. The war saw dramatic shifts in momentum, extensive international involvement, and substantial human and material costs. The legacy of the Korean War continues to shape the political, economic, and social dynamics of East Asia and remains a critical chapter in the history of the Cold War. The ongoing division of Korea and the enduring tensions on the Korean Peninsula are lasting reminders of the conflict's profound impact.